let's go into the section on Tocqueville and Tocquevillian issues of participation, and how does that relate to globalization, to scenes and related dimensions we want to introduce today. The word scenes is in the Scenescapes book most explicitly, but it builds up to this from the earlier background. Historically, of course, this was the book by Tocqueville, Democracy in America. He was invited by the French government to him to help to understand better what might be the future of France and Europe, to have this democracy. And so they chose the most developed democracy, so-called, in the world was the U.S. Tocqueville went there and published Democracy in America, the book. Many consider the most basic overview, insight of American society, what was distinctive from other societies, especially France. He contrasted with most explicitly with a stronger state, aristocracy, the 1789 revolution, etc. One big thing which he stressed was civic participation, people working together, talking together, where and how. He had many examples of this sort. Massachusetts farmers building a fence together to try to protect animals, people crossing from one area to another. But the point is, they built the fence together, and this kind of collaboration by average citizens was the model, which in turn generated a sense of sharing and legitimacy, that we could work together in building a fence that in turn could build a whole national political system. So was his generalization. The reason he stressed this was in part civic activities were illegal in France. You had instead a strong state, a strong church, but the idea that these groups might be competing with a strong state, strong Roman Catholic Church, might weaken the ability of a powerful emperor or king to want to implement his views, her views of how things were there and should be. This only changed at the end of the 19th century in France, gradually loosening up a bit. But even in the late 20th century, civic activities in France are very different from the U.S. and the rest of the world. The number one civic activity in the U.S. in the late 20th, 21st century is churches. People most often are distinctively involved in some kind of organization beyond themselves, beyond their families and individuals, where churches, especially smaller, activist, engaged churches, Calvinist, so-called. Many individual states were created specifically to differentiate from the next state, which had a different religious kind of program and background. Not so in much of Europe. Okay. The simple diagram, if we were to put it on a board, is civic activities generate trust and political legitimacy. This in turn was heightened by people migrating to different states because of religious differences, for instance, within the U.S., or not stressed so much by Tocqueville, by others, as we have Elazar migration from abroad, from another country, which can heighten these things further. To flash forward, late 20th century, Robert Putnam published a book, Bowling Alone. The simple argument took Tocqueville and said, if civic activity generates legitimacy, what if civic activity goes down? And his basic argument from his bowling league, where he visited back to his hometown and talked to the owner of the bowling alley, how are things? I have strong memories of bowling in my bowling league when I was a kid here. And he said, oh no, things are bad. I said, why? People are bowling alone. They don't come and eat, drink beer, have pretzels and so forth while they're bowling and talking with their friends and enjoy the situation together. And if they come alone, they don't drink or eat so many pretzels. Okay, it sounds small, like small stuff, but it was a difference between making money and losing money. And so the title of the book was Bowling Alone, as a metaphor for this is what's perhaps happening to the world, or at least the U.S., where he mostly focused in the data in that book, showed that in many kinds of civic activities, the Lions Club, not in that book, but later on has shown a number of churches are going down, especially among younger people. This was picked up by many others in individual organizations where they had seen a decline in membership and participation. And it became a bestseller, as well as a concern for the second related thing, which had been noticed, was an increase in distrust. The top political leaders did not have the trust which they did under General Eisenhower, under relatively charismatic, at least managers, if not tank commanders, whatever. All right, so this had a big impact among especially political scientists, sociologists, trying to say where and why might these civic activities work. And one was the concept of social capital, human capital. That is, capital comes from economics. Monetary capital, machinery was seen as the classic example. Gary Becker here at the University of Chicago did his PhD on human capital, and the basic measure was education. And people who have more capital in their heads and maybe their shoulders, but not just their shoulders, combined with their heads, could do new and better things with the same amount of money as others who didn't use it as thoughtfully. And human capital thus was an important independent variable along with the others. James Coleman here then pushed it further and talked about social capital and said social capital can be shared among people who are within an organization together. And having more people together, knowing each other, having personal contacts, a sense of personal relationship, these kinds of things which link together people was more than just, quote, are you a member? but that the membership can make you feel a part of something more general, and these organizations, these civic activities, churches, unions, the two biggest in the U.S. are churches and unions, or were. Churches have been slightly going down, unions have been going down a lot in 50 years. And in these ways, where and how might these be elaborated? What might be solutions? Putnam was vague. He was unsure himself. He didn't have clear data or evidence, and he had bits and pieces of answers, if you will, in the Bowling Alone paper and that book. Lots of others then tried to sharpen this a bit. But the point I would make is he wrote this as a bestseller, and it succeeded as selling highly, much read, but he simplified. And he said this explicitly in doing so. Putnam's a smart guy, and he wrote better and more sophisticated books before and after Bowling Alone. And I'll just mention a little bit the one before as an illustration of what could be done, what could have been done differently, or what combined, we have a different perspective in which we can generalize as we do in this section of the course. In his earlier book on democracy in Italy, Putnam contrasted the southern Italians, especially Sicily, which had been conquered by the Normans, and these northern European, there's still some blonde Sicilians today. They stayed there, they intermarried, they had a continuation, but nevertheless, the general sense was many of the Sicilians did not trust the Normans, and the isolation away from something which could be connect to one another, as is done in the some unions, or the churches, the smaller churches, which especially Tocqueville stressed there weren't any unions in the 18th century, early 19th century. Focus then was to look for what was the solution, and the solution in the South, much of the South especially, was the mafia, crime, organized crime, where you could knock on the door of a shopkeeper, for instance, and say, you know, people could break into your shop and steal your stuff when it's open or at night when it's closed. We can protect it for you if you'd like. Small contribution, please. Or as was recently said in the Chicago trial, have you been by the cash register? The spirit of clientelism and of personal relations through you give me a cash contribution and I'll give you something in turn instead is a model of a political system, which is still arguably one of the, if not still the most widespread model of how politics works globally. And we find it in some places, as I mentioned, like Chicago, where we have different branches of migrants in different parts of the world, but the leaders in Chicago have been especially persons who are more frequently Catholic than Protestant, to simplify it. Calvinist Protestants most especially tend to be the most distinct. The church in this example can be an alternative to the mafia. And in the rest of Italy, this could work in the sense of engaging people within the church. And successfully, and arguably in many surveys would show among Roman Catholics, in the U.S. especially, when they go more often to church, they tend to trust people more. However, that alone is not enough. I would say, what I'm building up to is how the membership alone is not enough. We need to know more about the patterns of how to understand it. And I'm building here now on a PhD thesis by Seoko Kim, S-E-O-K-H-O Kim. He worked at the National Opinion Research Center, where we've been doing studies of cities and leadership, initially in the U.S., but nationally and then internationally. And the interesting thing he did, he was from Korea, was to check and see if Tocqueville worked in Korea. And the answer was no. If some people are higher in church membership, which is by far even more in Korea than in the U.S., churches are the main organized activity to which Koreans belong, and there are other things as well. Singing groups, sports clubs, etc., unions. But the dramatic important finding conceptually was the Tocqueville-Putnam link that more civic activity generates more trust fails. The path is not 0.2 or 0.4 or 0.1, it was 0. And in some cases, if it's 0 for everything, all types of organizations, that meant that some organizations were even negative, and even if some were slightly positive. Nevertheless, the same data, the same kinds of identical survey items, when repeated in Northern Europe and in North America generally, did work, did hold. The Tocquevillian idea was supported. But if Korea was different, what's different in Korea? Well, first question was, is Korea unique? And so we had data available, and he replicated this and found if the same thing was also true, no relationship in Portugal and Brazil, Eastern Europe, Russia, and China. What were different about these places that did not generate the Tocquevillian dynamic? And once we found that some places fail, some places work, apparently, leads to the question of where and why. And this is what initially began with names of countries, because the data were collected and reported that way. But if we push it further, one then is where and how can we make sense of this more systematically? And this is what we're introducing in this week and next week on the mayors next week. This week I'm introducing this book in Tocqueville Karaoke, and second, the book Scenescapes. The idea of the scene is the sense that the context surrounding the organization of which you are a member, the church, for instance, is important to look at to see what kind of church it is, what kind of community. If it is in the state of Maine, for instance, differed from New Hampshire and differed from Massachusetts in the kinds of people who migrated and were members of a distinctive religious denomination. Rhode Island especially. These kinds of differences captured more generally national background, history, lifestyle, and other things. How does this relate back to Putnam and regional differences within Italy? He wasn't an historian, he's a political scientist, but he dug back and read around and looked a little bit further. And he then used a survey study, which was very creative. He went around and mailed to the leaders, the local government leaders in the regions, something like 50 or so regions across Italy. He sent a letter and said, could you please send me this form, standard, simple, basic form. And in many parts of northern Italy, you got the form back right away you got the form as requested, came back fine. In the south, especially Sicily, no answer. They'd send a second postcard, no answer. A third postmark, nothing. Then he or his collaborators would go to the government agency and say, could I please get a copy of this form? And they said, oh, well, either they didn't look, or they had an answer, or they had an excuse, but they never got the form in many of those local governments, regional governments. Why? You look for more close studies of who people lived there and what were their lifestyles, but might help interpret this. And the main thing he found was a book by a guy who trained here in Chicago, Edward Banfield, B-A-N-F-I-E-L-D, and he had an Italian wife. And when he had a sabbatical, they went to Italy, and he spent a year there. And he wrote a book which became so well known, it was in translation Italian, was for sale in all the airports in Italy. The moral basis of a backward society. How's that for a label for you? And not abstract scientific with your, no, I shouldn't say it's, the title for sure did not sound scientific. The analysis was very, very thoughtful and creative. And the Italians then, 10 years or so later, there was a paper in the American Political Science Review, a paper signed by and written by a couple of dozen smart Italian, mostly political scientists and others, saying, well, was Putnam right or wrong? And the consensus was that Putnam building on Banfield was right about the general description that the North versus the South is there, and the differences were there in the sense that people didn't have as much trust, but they didn't have an interpretation that they would agree upon. There were people who were Marxists, there were people who were corporate, whatever, that is, different kinds of oriented perspectives which they represented, and that may have influenced, biased their interpretations, but the simple point is they agreed the basic description was right. Putnam also is an American, but he bought a house, he bought a rented house, spent a lot of time in southern Italy himself. But it was Banfield who really wrote the book about this, and to give an example, farmers in southern Italy he would describe as going to church with some candles in their hand, and they would go to the saint who was a saint responsible for harvest. He would shake the candle and say, I will burn this candle in front of you in this pew, this section, alcove of the church, if you will give me rain but if you don't give me any rain, I'm not going to give you a candle. Okay. Distrust of the church, distrust of the saint or the clergy who may be involved, were distrusted. Husbands and wives distrusted. Neighbors distrusted, in ways that he had lots of detail about these kinds of things being much broader and not just organizational membership. They affected the family, personal relations, many other things. And that in turn he traced back to, at least to simplify, the Norman conquest and the alienation and the distrust of others from a globalization, if you will, in a manner that was seen as closer to a military domination than to intermarrying, building relationships between the newly, that is the Normans, I'll simply qualify. The Normans in Scotland, the English coast for several hundreds of years, many hundreds of years, they had little outposts. But then, and then when they went to France, they became there. They created a section of France called Normandy, named for the Normans. And then William the Conqueror in 1066 was when they saw a vacuum politically. William the Conqueror marched in, and they became king. He became king of England. Okay. Nevertheless, he saw there was lots of. He was a foreigner. Didn't speak much English. Spoke French, and so they built a more of a what we later call federalism, or a multiple level sense of political participation, which was not trying to build one strong state or one military dominating force, which is more what they had done in Sicily. So the difference is it's not inevitable that the style of the Normans was one or another style. The Normans is used as a general term for Scandinavians today. Denmark, Sweden, Norway, maybe Finland. These areas have been noticed as distinctive, particularly brilliantly by Stein Rokkan, Stein R-O-K-K-A-N, and the book of Lipset has a brilliant interpretation of Norway building into Western individualism when you answer where and why is the West different from Asia, and I'll just leave as a link there to say that it builds on it introduces another example of scene, that the scene around which the Norwegians lived were of two types. Those people in the center of Norway, where they had big plantations and flat land, and people who lived along the coast, the western coast, where there were fjords, little harbors, little inlets, about big enough for one family, small family, medium family, but pretty small. And that these in turn tended to build an individualistic perspective more generally. This is an interpretation that had been advanced by others, and it's been strongly politically distinguished for centuries. A simple, clear example of possibly the geographic background, which we could then generalize and say Switzerland had mountains, and these protected villages from each other, and especially people coming from far away, where they couldn't find one big city to dominate. Instead, it was much more decentralized, and Swiss government has had this ever since. There is basically no nation. It is a federation of communes, which are the main units of government. In this way, I've said that if Tocqueville had gone instead to Switzerland, he would have had a better, more pure example of democracy, because what he had not done in America was to go to the South, to go to other regions and seriously ask questions about what he asked in the Massachusetts farmer case. He would have gotten different answers. There's less trust in the South, there was, and there's more hierarchy in that sense. It's a bridge closer to the Normans as military, if you will, and the more widespread use of violence, which has spread as we've had migrants and migration, and this time's associated with slavery and the traditions of slave and subcultures, leading to different strong subcultures within the U.S. And I'm introducing these simply to simultaneously remember what you know about the subtypes of Elazar and the like, framing Tocqueville and Punam. Okay. One linkage, just to remind you of the New Political Culture book, we have a beginning of breaking up of the traditional left and right, as these terms were used in France, originated a couple of centuries ago. The left being more in favor of a larger government, helping more people, moving in a greater direction of equality in contrast to which to the right sometimes in France was more tradition and hierarchy. In other countries like the US, and in the 20th century, it meant more markets. Markets when introduced by Margaret Thatcher, then, only then did markets become so dominant. But the point is, even the Conservative Party had the same name as in other countries. It didn't have markets until more recently. And I'm adding this to frame, if you will, again, the critique of markets as in Saskia Sassen's book, Globalization. And globalization, in the same, I'll make this linkage, the scene idea is consistent with Boschkin's paper critiquing Sassen in making the point that there is no one globalization. There are many different dimensions. There can be entertainment, there can be transportation, there can be lifestyle, but not linked specifically to markets or Wall Street in that sense. In the sense, if you will, that there are different institutional arenas within one person's life. In one job, or if you have two jobs, there may be two different scenes where one is just with computers, another one may be highly personalistic in relating, for instance, to, say, working in a barber shop, where the personal relations count more, etc. Looking at where and why we have these kinds of differences is what I'm pointing to with the barbershop example, as this has been used, especially by a smart book here by a woman political scientist on barbershops and politics as a model of building relations among young African, not just young, but African American men have often congregated in a barbershop, even though it's not an organization, and that people could chat and build personal relations through the barber, through one another, maybe living in the same neighborhood, in ways that make this a distinctive kind of social capital. And if you just measure social capital, as Putnam had done, and some others have done, especially looking for simple measures, if people are members of an organized group like a union or a church, some African American men may be members of neither, but they may be linked in certain kinds of street corners or barber shops or liquor stores or basketball courts. As I live in Brownsville, I'm sensitive to other kinds of arenas that bring people together, even if you don't have a classic example of the sort which Tocqueville used. What we do, and which I then want to introduce here, is take a look at the last chapter of Tocqueville Karaoke, and look at the pictures. Read the text takes more time, but look through the pictures especially and see big patterns of where and why there are seem-like differences or institutional. That is, we use a number of ways of measuring these differences, of where and why two things may join and solve the apparent lack of trust in some cases, and successfully do in others. The book is called Tocqueville Karaoke, but it really has two big questions, and both of which are Western theories of how social relations should work. One is Tocqueville, as we've been discussing. The second one is more market-related, ideal Adam Smith type markets, where you have people getting what they want from the economic system. If we have competition working properly, we have the rules of the game, where you can have investment, and where you can have the producer look at what people want as consumers, and you try to make shoes which have the proportion of black shoes and red shoes and purple shoes, which more or less match this, which you're able to sell. Okay, the point is that many aspects of markets work less well, or they work differently in different contexts, like Southern Italy and Asia or Latin America, for instance. In Latin America, they have the weakest amount of trust in general. Maybe 10% of people in many of the Latin American countries have trust in the president, the national government, the police, in ways that maybe 50% in the US and 90% in some places in Scandinavia, for instance. The variations are there, and we want to see where and how these clusters of views of culture, perhaps, political cultures, local political cultures operate, get defined and transformed. And the book called The New Political Culture has about 20 propositions about where and why political cultures emerge and then are changed over time. And so Elazar and I worked together to try to build models which would have long histories combined with more recent changes in the dynamics of each. And these are things such as more income leads to more people having more choice, and therefore that in turn may lead to more searches for competition, which in turn may lead to being able to get what you want more often, and what the economists will call clearing the market, or having an equilibrium between supply and demand. Okay, assuming such things as shared information, competition, entry into the market activities. Okay, these kinds of patterns don't hold empirically so well in some versus other cases. And both of these we found big differences between the West and China, Japan, Japan, Korea, especially where we had collaborators who were interested in exploring these things. So we had about 15 or so co-authors of the book called Tocqueville Karaoke, mostly Asian and Portuguese, linked to Brazil, to try that they were chosen specifically to try to engage and understand better why we had these different patterns. Several years, and the chapters over time show you how some of it came together. One was Peter Achterberg, Dutchman, came here for a summer, and we reanalyzed the data that Putnam had used and thought about what he'd been doing. And one simple question was, what kinds of organizations that may be generating more trust? Instead of just saying organizations support trust, let's look at types of organizations. He didn't report doing this. So we looked at it, and we found he was generally right that most organizational membership has been going down. Unions, Lions clubs, Boy Scouts. But one other one was the total opposite. And this was arts and culture was really taking off, especially among younger persons. Even if these were often volatile and they were not long-term members or memberships as organizations, they could be a stand-up comedy club started as a college activity, which may disappear when they graduate or a year or two later, or they change their types of jokes, their types of outfits, clothes, costumes, etc. And so what happens if we pay attention to the arts? So when starting from that finding, we then went a lot further. Dan Silver and Carl Grodock did an edited book on little case studies where we found things about the arts in many small towns, big cities around the world, mostly Northern Europe, but not only. North America and Europe, but also a little bit elsewhere. So we wanted to explore this more globally, especially in Asia, and see where and why it was different. So what we did and there were sections in individual chapters, but the last chapter we did with I did with the Portuguese two co-authors, and three were really involved over time. What was different in the way that the arts were different in the kinds of content, and we looked for examples. For instance, there was one neighborhood, it was a big neighborhood, or even where there were many artists living together, talking with each other, painting and so forth. They were sometimes disagreeing with others in China, but one kind of painting which had been painted and then sold, and the same painter did the same thing again and again, was a painting of Mao swimming in a river in blood. Okay, so you have this kind of critique of the red color, the imagery of the establishment in ways that is very improper and unusual for China, to be sure. But it gives you an example of a very different kind of potential perspective from, say, Sicily in southern Italy, where for centuries, as well as quite contemporary, the classic paintings were of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and aspects of the Bible and of the Roman Catholic traditional paintings in style. They were not challenging the political system. They didn't talk about the Normans, whatever. that sense, Catholicism and the legitimacy of Christianity could be repeated through art in the Virgin Mary painting holding the baby Jesus again and again and again and again, whereas you could instead have Mao swimming in red blood. Okay. Where and why do we have different conceptions of the arts? That's what we tried to measure with different patterns of types of artistic activities in different subgroups as they are variously painted or purchased or participated with. If you are participating in an art form such as dancing or going to other activities as a participant in certain ways. We had survey data of individual citizens of what kinds of artistic activities do you do, and then then we have questions of trust. Who do you trust or not? And so we connected these things. We then had 4 different types of participation and four arenas of activity, which could be a church, a union, that is different sorts, and then where and how much these things differentially relate to levels and changes of trust and legitimacy and some related pieces. I won't try to build into too much, but I'll simply say some of the tables show both national and regional differences, such as Northern Protestant Europe versus Southern Catholic Europe, and then the examples I'm giving you of Sicily, contrasted with the Northern European artists were more often, and the people who were purchasing and supporting the arts were more often challenging the political system. Bohemians were sometimes used as a label, and starting from France, especially with Balzac writing about this, and Baudelaire, leading to a critique of society and to a sense of distrust. So that most of, as we've looked at the titles of the memberships of voluntary or of all kinds of, the Yellow Page category of organizations in France, have all kinds of things like former Communist Party members who lost elections. That's the name of an organization that you can be a member of in France. Not to mention all different kinds of interesting activities, which are often critiquing and challenging the contemporary civic and political leadership of France, and also monitoring and then critiquing, looking for scandals of government officials. This in turn, I could say 20 years later, we have seen in such things, both in most dramatic were, say, Italy and France. Berlusconi, active as a media owner and political activist, became elected the head of Italy, but basically the whole political system collapsed in the other parties, driven in part by young lawyers and others in these organized groups in both France and Italy, critiquing and bringing lawsuits and bringing trials and attacking the corruption, quite clear, quite explicit, very expensive, raising the cost of buying and selling goods. The simple so-called economic relations were taxed on, quote, taxed with a patronage contribution or a corrupt taking of cash. And of course, this is also has been documented around much of the world for a long time, including our city of Chicago. Okay, Similarly, in the last 20, especially 20 years, the reform, the anti-corruption efforts have grown so much more active and so much more morally labeling these have heightened with egalitarianism, especially after 1968 and 1989, these two political, university, cultural, if not economic revolutions. Where and how have these kinds of cultural changes been implemented, and where and how would these be with organized activities or something else? Well, we can read about more of these, but I'll just give you one or two dramatic extremes as we try to make the point, as Lipset has done in his work several times. Look for deviant extreme cases of what you want to see, say, of such as the Virgin Mary in Sicily and the Bohemian critics in the art itself, as in novels, as in poems, as in Baudelaire's writing about the river Styx, so-called. Bad is good, thereby challenging what is good or what is bad. Consider it a strong model. I've used Chicago a number of times. The state of Illinois has also had more governors and more political leaders who've gone to jail or have been tried for, have been indicted for possibly going to jail of any other state in the U.S. except for Louisiana. Lots of stuff appears in the press regularly, and where and how has reform in that sense emerged and become more salient? And can we learn from this and look for ways of aiding efforts, if you will, to counter alternatives? And I won't even necessarily always use the term corruption, which has a strong moralistic overtone, and it's called among political scientists patronage or clientelism. Patronage is still moralistic, if albeit a little less. But third is the term corruption, or sorry, not corruption, but clientelism, another C. So clientelism versus corruption and patronage in the middle, basically the same kind of thing, but they have broader things which are embedded within personal relations. And that personal relation, which we've then found, among other things, is the Protestant Catholic differences. Those cities, those neighborhoods, those individuals tend to be more concerned about fighting corruption if they were in New England in the past, and they were the ones that were, especially women, in places like Cambridge, Massachusetts, and in the 18th century, they were fighting in meetings to abolish slavery in the American South. This was not in Massachusetts, this was in Alabama and Georgia and so forth. And so the same thing was going on in England with the so-called nonconformist churches that again had this stronger egalitarianism. Even if women did not have the right to vote in elections, they could hold meetings and this kind of activity, which Tocqueville wrote about as a distinctive activity, the number one theme of meetings and public meetings of this sort were women meeting to fight, abolish slavery, and second, to abolish alcohol. That having drunken husbands, families not holding together because of drink. And both in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln met the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, he said, "So you're the little lady who created the big war." Woodrow Wilson, as president, had been president of the United States, had been previously president of Bryn Mawr Ladies Women's College, where I had my mother and some others and family went there, and to have a sense of its distinctive orientation of embedding a moralistic and a political engagement together. And Woodrow Wilson was important in running and implementing alcohol abolishing, which was the period of prohibition in the 1920s and 1930s in the U.S. In some neighborhoods, that is, in my neighborhood of Bronzeville, it was the most successful economic and political activity, especially economic, that's more easily qualified and quantified. Lots of bars, lots of clubs, lots of people coming from other neighborhoods, the white northern neighborhoods of the city or suburbs would come to these clubs with black performers, dance, and available to purchase and take home in your car were cartons of alcohol, whiskey, etc. And the end of this was in 1933 when Roosevelt ran against abolition, and this in turn led to Al Capone and our gangsters having their economic foundation being destroyed, etc. So this is, we go into in more detail in other courses, but it has a big impact on the neighborhood dynamic of where and how these different political cultures have drastically been altered. Another big type of reform, in addition to Abraham Lincoln, we could add Jane Jacobs as a Chicago area, or Rockford, northern Illinois denizen. Internationally, she was a model globally of political activism and anti-establishment, or anti-corrupt establishment. Continued with the New York fiscal crisis of New York City, and basically the related chronologically was the taxpayers' revolt in Proposition 13 in California in 1978. 2/3 of Chicago, of California's citizens said, let's cut property taxes by half. We don't want so much government, we don't want to pay taxes. And even people who were employees of the city of California were asked while leaving, what did you vote for? Yes, I'm in favor of Prop 13, I want to cut taxes. And even though you're working for the state of California, and you know, aren't you going to hurt your job? And the answer was, my home is more important than my job. That is now an issue for China, for the rest of the world, as people grow a little bit more affluent, they care less about their work. They have a little bit more, in this example, money invested in a home, or at least the bank may own it, but they more or less think in terms of it being theirs. These kinds of new transformations in a consumption direction, leading to the focus on lifestyle combined with egalitarianism. That is, most American states do not have propositions and referenda of this sort, nor do they're usually, if they do something like this, as they do in Eastern Europe or in Russia, they may have a vote, but it's an advisory kind of referenda, which is often carefully organized, let's say, and so forth. But in the case of California, this was a revolution which continued then a couple of years later, and same thing in Massachusetts and Michigan happened, and this was then been called the Taxpayers' Revolt, leading to people on the left, traditionally, say the Democratic Party in the U.S. We then dug in further and found after 1974, half of the U.S. cities were cutting their budgets. And this hadn't been noticed because it wasn't, they hadn't broken up the data carefully enough to see this. But when we did this, we found 1974 was 4 years before Prop 13 and was 6 years before the election of Ronald Reagan nationally. And many said Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were the causes of cutting back government. They took, that is, our data, our simple chronology suggests, they were footnotes in doing this 2, 4, 6 years later than many other cities had done this. And so looking at some of those and where and why these mayors had done this earlier is started to do, and that's why we found this in cities of Pittsburgh, and then later New York with Koch, and then people laughed at me from these years in the 70s until the election of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair in England. They then explicitly did what the mayors had been doing for many years, and that's what we call the new political culture, identified especially by fiscal conservatism, at least caution about having too much government and trying to hold down taxes, incorporating the Taxpayers' Revolt, at the same time retaining the social liberalism, tolerance, feminism, gays, environmentalism. These classic progressive social issues were joined with a fiscally cautious perspective. Dianne Feinstein, Bill Clinton, Tony Blair. These new fiscal populists, we initially called them, and then we continued with the stress on the social and consumption issues, and then later with entertainment and so forth. We then can classify these as neighborhoods and orientations of different political leaders. But the critical thing is that these were not invented by the political leaders. They came from the citizens, and through leaders who said, for instance, Governor Jerry Brown, when Prop 13 passed, Jerry Brown, before it had been passed, practically all classic organized groups, the political civic groups, the business groups, the government agencies, all said, don't support this Proposition 13. These schools will have problems funding themselves. We won't have swimming pools open. We won't have this and this and this. Citizens voted right against them. And so what the governor did was to completely reverse himself that day. The next day, he said, I will be implementing this new set of programs of cutting these wasteful, overspending, irresponsible government agencies that are doing too much. So he reversed his whole set of policies in ways that we have then, Marty Lipset did a paper tracing this 10 or so years later, by the socialist parties and to some degree the communist parties of the world moving in the same kind of direction to, for instance, if not just cutting, more often by decentralizing, transferring the responsibility to maintain a swimming pool or a public transit system, or subsidies which would no longer be matched by a federal or higher level government, but instead would give the responsibility to the mayors and local officials, and they in turn would then seek to, with enough numbers that they would get reelected, if we would find big increases in numbers, and then we found the same things as well. Citizen surveys who wanted this new pattern moving toward more social liberalism at the same time with fiscal conservatism. Okay, so if that was a big shift, these looked not at a single referendum or a single kind of membership in the Boy Scouts as being the indicator, but the view, the local or the shared political culture in people's heads, as well as in their neighborhood, as well as in their regions, and then regions like the Italian regions I've stressed, or the American South, in contrast to New England, we have these kinds of differences in orientation, informing the scene and the rules of the game about where and why trust may work as expected and described by Tocqueville, or where it may work in different ways. For instance, karaoke, can Tocqueville karaoke ask the question, karaoke, is this something which is chosen by the individual members to do so for fun? Classically in Asia, no. The managers, the office leaders of a particular office in a big corporation would classically go to bars or restaurants and then sing karaoke after, if they stop work, they might spend 4 more hours together, drinking, smoking, singing together karaoke. But was this a genuinely shared kind of perspective? And does it generate more legitimacy in the leadership? We don't have as much clear evidence as we would like, but given the fact that this was organized in the past by the organized leaders, not by the citizens, it may not have had the Tocquevillian result, and it may have been closer to what Seoko Kim for Korea found. Indeed, people who participate more in some organizations, some activities, do not increase their trust. So the arts can make a difference, but if contingent on the content of the meaning, the culture surrounding of the karaoke with its managerial domination versus a Mao swimming in blood as a different kind of symbol of what the art is doing, viewed, seen, reinforced. And so 1968, 1989, the years of student revolts, of Tiananmen Square, of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, these were not just events, these are markers of the transformation of values toward egalitarianism, toward more participation for many different persons around the world. On social media, dramatically doing this and being able to be implemented with your own cell phone, where you can choose or not to choose one or this, either this or another program, and then those numbers are counted, so we know from Amazon or from other sources, YouTube, many different national versions of these in China or elsewhere, and which report how many people are paying attention to this or that program, this or that website, this or that, not just buying, but also where you're listening to a rap song, so that the African American gangs don't just sell things for money. They also want instead to see what their gangster rap rating is on social media. I will end there, as we are themes which we will continue on Wednesday.